Hello and welcome to another training session. We're doing some more live training online here on YouTube. I got with myself here, my best friend Steve Campbell. Steve, welcome.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Great to be back. Season 8 doing these, so really excited to get on this very interesting topic, I think.
I think so too. And Steve and I we were just talking before we jumped onto the live stream here. We just enjoy learning about these things, exploring these ideas, and kind of pushing on these concepts around deployment governance and how to get things out into your Power BI environment. So with that, Steve's got a presentation that he's gone through and has refined and kind of thought through a lot of the documentation needs you may have or things you want to consider as you're trying to move Power BI reports from maybe a development environment into a production environment. And this changes based on if you're a team of users, a department, and potentially the enterprise. There's potentially some different considerations as you need to think through this. With that, let's jump right in. I'll turn on your screen share, Steve, and let's just go. Let's go to town.
Yeah. So thanks, Mike. As Mike mentioned, so this is really looking through some documentation, some planning stuff. So we're looking now at the stage where we're starting to plan this, to plan having an enterprise solution and implement some good governance. How this came about is, so I've actually implemented governance and this kind of stuff as my role as a consultant in several large enterprises and several large companies. So these are actually the real documents and the real process I go through with clients that I've gone through, implemented at several places now. So what I thought would be very useful is just to give a nice high-level summary here, just to kind of show what we actually do in the real world. So this is an example of some of these strategy documents and these other things that we can get from a nice Power BI and how to put this really good governance and deployment, strategy around it. So the first part, as Mike mentioned, is looking through these documents. And these are going to be documents and processes really that we put and that we decide to document and write down. There's going to be 3 points to this. And the first one we're going to look at here is the strategy documents. So the strategy documents. Again, we normally do this either pre-deploying Power BI and Fabric, or maybe you've already deployed it, you're already looking, and you think it's time to kind of get some tighter governance, get some more enterprise stuff around this. So this can be done, after you deployed it. Any time really is good. And typically these sort of documents, I like to call them, living documents. These will be updated. And as your company changes, as your use changes, you'll go back and really look at all of these.
I can echo that statement. We have definitely done a number of these similar things as well. And these are 100% living documents. Whatever you build today needs to be revisited later on. And I'd also argue, particularly with process maps and policies, these should be reviewed quarterly, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year as a company policy. So as you're building the center of excellence around your Power BI environment, these are things you're going to set up now and get started with. But later on, you definitely want to have a plan to regularly review them and schedule reviews of these and kind of improve them based on you as you learn things. I'll say another example. If you look at my models I built 5 years ago, I would definitely want to rebuild them now. And so this is the same kind of concept. If you revisit these policies, you've learned a lot in your company around what works for you, and these will have to be kind of updated and modified over time.
For sure. And if you did anything about 2 years ago, now since Fabric's come out, I think you have a lot of updating. So
it's true. That's very true.
as much as we love Microsoft having all these new products moving fast, it's something that you do want to keep on top of.
And they keep us on our toes, that's for sure.
Awesome. So the first strategy document, the first thing that we look up is we generally set up this champions network. I love the terminology champions network. And I will say a lot of this has been derived from the adoption roadmap on the Microsoft websites. So definitely go and read that. It helps a lovely supporting document for doing any of this and give some good context and thoughts around that. So we like to use the word champions network. And this is the Power BI champions. And, this can be updated. You could call it the Fabric champions. You might have, slightly different ones for slightly different teams. We're going to focus more on the Power BI side of things here, but this very much applies to the whole of Fabric. So this really relates to a centralized team of these Power BI users. So these are maybe what people call power users, these core users. You get this group of users who are really, really good. And what we say is, okay, this champions network, this is going to be a formal group. So we really want to say this is a formal group who meet regularly. And part of this, as Mike mentioned, going forward after you've set this up, you would have hopefully things like forums or a center of excellence. And this is where these groups will meet. And they're, a specialized unit. What they are is people who know the tool, Power BI, or if you have a Fabric.1 Fabric, know it really, really well. And it's not necessarily a role, and it doesn't, necessarily require them to be a certain role or level, but it's really about their knowledge of the tool. And they're there to help influence the architecture and design of the strategy. So when you are designing the strategy, whoever it is, you need the people who know the tool and know how things work really, really well. Also, and normally we give them, a security group, an entry group, something like that. So they're a specific group within Azure so that we know who they are. And that way we actually give them certain permissions. So it could be, validating security models. And these could be the ones which are actually able to certify models, certify semantic models in Fabric, which we'll talk a bit more about. Also, people who are probably going to be, providing or training and support. So this is the first thing we do is we find these people, set this up and make a formal group. And the next, and this is really important, is to create this RACI. Now, this isn't a Microsoft term or a Fabric term, but a RACI is a document that's really helpful for making sure everyone knows who does what. So RACI is an acronym, and it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And what we do is we essentially list out all of the tasks and all of the things that need doing. And we write down for each of those who is responsible. Responsible means who is actually going to do it, who's going to complete the task. Accountable is who is accountable overall for it to get done. And this could be different from the person who is responsible. So your manager might be accountable, and it's up to them to make sure the tasks get done, but they might delegate it out to someone. So someone is accountable, it's up to them to make sure it's done, but the person who's responsible actually does it. Next, we'll have consulted. These are people who won't be completing the task or aren't accountable for it, but they need some input into the task. So you need to ask their advice, and it's really important that they're consulted. They have influence on how this is completed because they have some knowledge or need to give you something, give you some advice on how to do it. Finally, you have informed. This isn't as important to the task, but it's people who need to know about the output of the task, and they just need to be told about the result because it might affect how they do stuff, but they don't have any influence on how it's done. So here's an example of what we would do for the RACI. So each of this, we would have a whole list of tasks, and you can kind of sit down and think through these, and these can get quite big, these RACIs, but I would say make something manageable at first, and you can always add over time. So for example, we're going to list out all the tasks that need to get done for us to roll out this strategy and for the strategy to be successful. So you might say, define the vision for Power BI. Well, in this case, we will list the task on the left. And you can see each of these columns are different roles. Now, it's good to make the roles a role and not, a specific person. And the role might not be necessarily a job title, but it could be a role related to data. So for example, we've got the Power BI champions. That's that formal group, that role who is a Power BI champion. You'll probably have a Power BI admin or more. And this, this could be Fabric as well. And you might have some concepts in your company, such as data stewards, corporate sponsors, or, an information security lead. This will be highly specialized and up to your specific company, the size of your company, and the types of people that you have. You can see here, for example, define the vision for Power BI. So we want a vision. We want to say, how is Power BI going to be used? Why are we implementing it? That's up to the corporate sponsor. They're both accountable and responsible. So you'll notice you can be more than one thing. So often, sometimes the person who is accountable is also responsible if they're not going to delegate it. They need to ask, though, the Power BI champions, because the Power BI champions in this case are very knowledgeable. They could influence, they could have input to the vision. So while the corporate sponsor defines it and is accountable for it, they do ask the Power BI champions and they get their input. Then we have a few people who are informed. And you can see as you go down, you kind of list these out and you'll have sometimes there's lots of different people involved in the task. Sometimes there's few. This will be, of course, dependent on our company. And this is something you'll sit down with your stakeholders and you'll sit down with each of these roles, kind of identify them. And this is one of the key tasks and one of the ones that actually takes probably the longest. Really important to do, and I really recommend it because going forward, this makes sure that tasks get done well and it makes sure we know who should be doing it and then who they need to ask. So it's a really, really useful document to have.
I can't stress this point enough. I think this is a very relevant point, and as I've done these within our companies as well, this is a major point of contention. Sometimes departments just don't communicate well between different departments, and as we're trying to build this, community of practice around these Power BI champions, those champions may not all live under the same boss or the same manager, or they may be different people in different departments and groups. And so, in order to collect those voices together, this really does, I think, help make a very clear, pointed note around these are the different roles and stakeholders in this engagement with Power BI. I think, honestly, having a real conversation around this makes this a win. It gives a lot of confidence to leadership above the corporate sponsor or other team members that, hey, we really do have complete thoughts around how we should be playing together as a team. So this is really a play for let's communicate well together across teams.
Exactly. 100%. So once we've created the RACI then, and we have this communication there, one of the next things I wanted to do is sort of start creating these process maps. I love process maps. I come from a bit of a process background, but really process maps show people how to complete tasks and then who is responsible for each step. This goes on a bit deeper than a RACI. You won't necessarily have one for each step in the RACI, but this is going to be key things more on the technical side, processes that should be done. One of these that we often set up is something such as certifying a semantic model. We'll talk about certification later, because we want this to be done in the same way over and over again. If we have a semantic model which has a certification check next to it, we want to make sure this means the same thing across departments, across teams. Sometimes we'll also do ones such as creating workspaces, that we know a workspace strategy is always followed and is always the same when we make our workspaces, and so the correct things are filled out. This really makes, as I say, it's all about consistent throughout the company, throughout different teams. And then we'll look at them, but everyone who's involved in the process map, they should be in the RACI, and we should be able to tie this back to the RACI as well to show that, these people are at least consulted, informed within a RACI, and these should use those same roles. We want to keep the same roles. So with that, let's show an example, and we're going to look at quite a simple example. These can get big and complicated, but let's have a look at a process map for semantic model certification. If you're not familiar with certification, it's a setting that can be done on a semantic model in Fabric, and it's used to say that this semantic model is validated, it's correct, and it's trustworthy. And that's something that's really key, that our data is trustworthy, and we've done something to make sure that we know this data is ready for use. So the first thing you want to do is create the swim lanes. And for the certification process, there's going to be two people involved. We're going to have the content creator and the Power BI champions. Now, this might be different for your company. It can be very different depending on the size and the type of people, the type of resources you have. But often I like to say the Power BI champions, they are the people who are able to certify. And you can actually turn on a setting in the admin settings to say only certain people, only this certain security group are able to certify semantic models. I normally say this is the Power BI champions because they're the ones who understand data enough in order to apply the expertise. So, and then Mike, if you could just kind of move our faces here.
Oh yeah, we're kind of covering the screen here a little bit. Let me just adjust it slightly. How
Thank
about
you.
this one? There we go.
Perfect.
There we go. Thanks.
We normally put these symbols out, right? And these can get more advanced. This is process mapping. And if you Google process mapping, again, this isn't a Microsoft thing, but you'll be able to find ways that you enjoy how to do this. So what we do there is we'd always have a start. And the model is always going to start with a content creator. That's going to be the person, whoever created the semantic model. So then they have an action. They're going to say, oh, I'm going to submit my model for certification. There's a few ways it could be submitted. Maybe it's want to be used company-wide, it just got really popular. But typically, when we say we want to submit a model for certification, it's going to be one that is going to be really important and could support a lot of reports or has really valuable data. Then this goes down to the Power BI champions. And what they're going to do is they're going to run some data model checks. They're going to check whether this data model is up to speed for certification. Is the DAX correct? Is it star schema? This sort of stuff. Then this can either fail or pass. If it fails, we say, okay, you want to certify this model, except I've noticed that it's not star schema. We need to make some adjustments so it's up to scratch. If it does pass, what we'll say is we'll probably set up a CI/CD pipeline, or at least do some sort of testing so that we can test the data. Again, that can also fail or pass. If it fails, we say, the model was good. However, when we tested the data, when we tested the DAX, we noticed some errors. If it does pass, then we certify it. So this can get a lot more complicated, but this is a good example of having a repeatable way to certify data sets, which really gives, if we certify something, certify semantic models, if we do certify, it has a good reason and has gone through the same process as a separate semantic model has.
And to bring back your point here, I know you're kind of completing things here. Oh, sorry, Steve, you have one more bubble. I'll let you do the last bubble and then I'll come back with a question.
Yeah, no, I think the last one is just to alert your users.
There we go.
That it was completed.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I jumped in there a bit too quick. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you have content creators and Power BI champions. Just to be clear, I want to really hone in on your point you said earlier. When we're doing RACI documents around making sure we understand who's responsible, who's informed, the individuals in that RACI document is the same rows, the swim lanes that we're seeing here. So I just want to bring that correlation there because sometimes there's a disconnect between, the RACI doesn't quite exactly match us. If someone needs to be informed, if someone is in that RACI diagram on how to get content out the door, how to get a semantic model approved and deployed into dev, test, and prod, the same RACI individuals or roles, not the people, we're not talking about the people, the roles are the same ones that are in these swim lanes. So you got to make sure that whatever you're doing, those two pieces match, because that really adds clarity. Because a lot of these items here are, you need to notify somebody. Someone needs to be informed. That means this process needs some sort of kick out that says they're not doing something, but we're notifying this leader, this content creator, this person that, hey, thank you very much, but we didn't approve your process. You need to go fix these things, and then they can complete it. So I think this also is a very nice tie-in between that RACI document and what we're talking about here in the swim lanes and the process flowing.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely tie back. That is a really important point. Again, not every single item in the RACI necessarily needs a process map. These are ones for things that you want repeatable and are important. So we said define the vision for Power BI.
Agree.
Probably going to happen once. We don't need to make a process map for that. Something like this, where it's a process that will happen hopefully many times. This is where we want to apply those process maps and track them back to roles in a RACI.
Love it.
And finally, we kind of look at some policies. Now, often we will just have influence in the policies because it might be created if your company has a lot of policies, it might be created by a separate team. But generally, they're just sets of guidelines and rules. And this is just kind of how to manage things, really. Depending on your company, you might have policies in certain formats. There's no real, master format for it. But it's really just a framework for kind of these decision-making standards. And you just want to have consistency. So sort of policies are things like security rules, usage and access, things about certification, or just things about how to comply to GDPR or PIP or anything else, industry specific or country specific regulations. So it's just somewhere to list guidelines, rules, procedures, right? Just list these out to make sure that we're not doing anything we shouldn't, and they're very important for security. Again, normally working with specialized teams who do this within the company. If you ask, you probably have some policies somewhere there. So those are kind of those first strategy documents that we deploy and that we write. Next, really look at honing this certification and sensitivity. Now, the first one I like to do is sensitivity labels. This is not a specific Fabric thing, and it does apply to other Microsoft, such as Documents and other Microsoft tools. But sensitivity labels are in the information protection, so they're not necessarily part of the Fabric. So often when you're looking at this one, you're again working with maybe the security team or someone in the information protection team. You can turn these on in the Fabric admin portal just to make sure you're able to apply sensitivity labels. And what sensitivity labels are is that in your semantic models, you can apply specific labels to have specific actions. So you can say that any data that's exported from your Power BI, if, for example, your semantic model has a sensitivity label saying this is confidential, then people won't be able to open documents, even Excel files, of data that's been exported from this semantic model. So it's a really good way to stop data leakage. And so what we say is maybe you already have sensitivity labels in your organization. Maybe you want to create some new ones. Again, they're not specific to Fabric, but I'm really recommending asking and having some sensitivity labels. We often have that if you want to certify a semantic model, one rule is that it has to have a sensitivity label. And it could be, general information that's not sensitive, but this is a really good way so that if it does have sensitive information, you can apply the sensitivity label. It will lock that model down a bit more. And there's rules that can be set up in the label that can stop users doing stuff and stop data leakage. Then we look at semantic model certification. So we looked at an example of a process map around this, but this is a really, really great point. And I think certification is a fantastic feature in Fabric, and one that I really recommend looking at when you're talking about enterprise data. What we would say is if it's certified, we show that this data is trustworthy. And often we'll say, well, what should be certified? We don't have to certify everything. Maybe I'm just doing some ad hoc, analysis for my boss. Maybe I just make a quick model. What we do want to certify, though, is if there's business critical reports, anything that's, we're making business decisions on, really important decisions, that should come from a certified model. And when we say it comes from a certified model, it means this model's gone through checks to make sure that this data is really up to scratch, that we know it's trustworthy, we know it's correct. And again, we normally say only Power BI champions or certain people are allowed to certify models. and they have to follow the process. So there's a very methodical way to certify and make sure that everyone is done the same way and goes through the same process, then we know it really is trustworthy. Often there'll be extra, training to be in this champions group, and they have to be told the processes and this sort of stuff.
I really like that point there because I think this is a lot around building guardrails. This is building the edges by which we can play in. Like one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to clamp the business's hands so tight that they can't do anything. That's inefficient. And we want to allow people to be able to have flexibility to make things, but yet do it within a governed and a secure way. That's the goal here.
Exactly, and I think that's a great point. We let people still build stuff, and you can still build stuff on your own
Yep.
and kind of get things up and going, for ad hoc work.
Mhm.
However, if we're doing business critical stuff, there's a thing to say, this has gone through that. It's not just been thrown together on someone's desktop. This has gone through proper testing. And It's a great way to differentiate so that, as you say, we allow people to build and not clamp things down.
Agree 100%.
One asset I would build for certification is something like this, which is a certification checklist. And this is just a bunch of rules. Now, when the Power BI champion is reviewing the model to say, will it pass the data model checks? We have these list of checklist items. And again, these are very company specific and go quite high. But normally one would run the best practice analyzer, which is a function of Tabular Editor. If you haven't ever heard of that, I would recommend having a look at a Tabular Editor and the best practice analyzer. But it's going to run some checks on the code to make sure that your code's optimized and written in a good way. Here you can see here in this specific checklist, we say, is a sensitivity label applied? And does it follow the star schema? So this is sort of stuff, and we might have severities on, if this really is a very severe, we might pass it back. Otherwise, we might say, we'll certify it as long as there's an explanation of whether this checklist item has passed or not. But maybe a certification for sensitivity label, that's a requirement. So what we would do is I would actually add this input here. So into my process, I would say there is a specific document that I have to refer to called the data certification checklist. And that's how we run these data model checks. So it's good to put this in the process. So we know that for the data model check, we refer to this data certification checklist. When that passes, we run the CI/CD pipeline. So just if you're familiar with CI/CD, we would do testing. We would then run tests. We'll probably hopefully have test scripts. I would say, does this pass? Has this been tested against your data as well? So the certification checklist kind of checks the model, checks the code, checks the structure.
Mm-hmm.
Then the CI/CD pipeline tests the actual numbers. Is your calculation correct? Because you could have a well-written DAX formula, but it might be calculating the wrong thing. So you have to check both. Now, once we've written our strategy documents, we've really looked and honed in on this certification and these sensitivity labels. The next thing we're going to look at is starting to design some optimized architectures. So we just say optimized architectures show how different architectural patterns based on different delivery scopes. Delivery scopes, then, it describes kind of the separation of data assets. So this would be things like semantic models, data flows, data factories and pipelines, this sort of stuff, anything in the data manipulation versus your visualization assets. And these are reports and Excel sheets, anything where you're not writing in directly doing the ETL and manipulating data, but you're more visualizing it. So we like to split these out into two different thoughts. Then we create some architectural diagrams, which show how workspaces are deployed, what gateways, all of this sort of stuff. And we'll have a look at some examples of this now. So this then is what we would do is we generally talk and think, how is this company going to use data? How is data going to be deployed, and how are we going to split data assets versus visualization assets? And usually there'll be a number of different models because there'll be a number of different use cases within the business. What we then do is make these grids and say, compare the data assets, the visualization assets, against groups. Now, we normally use the end users, the business users, the Power BI champions, but make sure what makes sense for your company. So you can see in model 1 on the far left, the team BI. And this is the ownership where we put X's in who's going to own each of these. So in the team BI, this is where the business units themselves, so maybe finance, sales, HR, they will create the data assets. So they'll create the semantic models and they'll create reports. So this is normally just doing, team individual BI where finance are making finance reports. They're doing stuff for finance. Business units own and share data within their teams. And there's normally a bit less security requirements because we're not sending data away. We might have departmental BI, where the business units then create the data models and create the semantic models. However, what they do is they just share those semantic models and let end users build their own reports of them. So a bit more self-service. So business units kind of own the data while they let other units build data sets off this. This is really good. Maybe you have finance teams where lots of other teams request data from them. If you want that, this could be a good way, and you could let end users self-service. So finance aren't spending all their time listening to ad hoc requests. They say, here's the data model. You can build your own stuff. You can connect to it. And this kind of follows what we call a data mesh architecture. If you haven't heard of data mesh, don't worry. But it generally just means that we have very departmental and they kind of treat their data as an asset, almost like a product. Finally, a model we often use is enterprise BI, where it's very similar, but maybe the data assets don't belong to a specific department. Maybe it's a bit more general, and that way it's owned by the Power BI Champions network. So it's kind of owned by this third-party network of no specific department. Then what we would say is maybe, I'll look at this team BI, and for the team BI, we would kind of make maybe some documentation on how we would lay out the workspaces and how we would lay out tools and stuff. So maybe in a simpler organization on the left here, if you have a team BI workspace, if you're following these workspaces, we will just have one workspace where all the data assets and the visualization assets, and this is probably for departments which aren't that familiar, all live in the same workspace. Or maybe if your departments and there's a bit bigger use, you might create 3 different workspaces, one for dev, one for test, one for prod. Another example would be maybe, and within your organization, you'll normally have a mixture of different types of models, right? So you might have some users which follow a team and they're just doing stuff in their team, but you'd also have some enterprise models. You also have these well used that doesn't fit within a team off to the business. And these ones might follow, even more complex kind of these architectures. You might say, well, if we're doing an enterprise BI type of workspaces, we need 6 workspaces, 3 for data assets alone, 3 for visualization assets alone, and split between the dev, test, and the prod. Again, this would very much depend on what development tools you use, what the data sources are, how much of a knowledge there is between stuff like CI/CD and the difference within your organization and their familiarity with it. Should we design this to your organization? And within the organization, we design each of these to the type of model that you would deploy for this specific use case.
I want to point out something here very clear around all of these points here as well is, as we're thinking about these kind of architecture pieces, you're playing a balancing game between, do I build more things, but I need more people to manage it, right? So, every time we talk about this, we always want everything to be 100% right, always correct, great outside, deployment is perfect every time. That sometimes comes with a bit more overhead around process and the people that you need to know how to do these things. So a lot of this is Some organizations don't need these really large architectures, but others do. You have to be able to understand what are the possibilities in enterprise, departmental, and team level architectures, and make sure that you design your team around, if this is what we want, the leadership must commit to, we got to have the right amount of people to deliver this kind of solution. So I do want to really point out here very clearly, this is a negotiated topic within your company that will help you decide. If you're a small team of 1 or 2 people, I don't recommend going really big architectures, because all they'll be doing is continually working on the artifacts and the process, and they'll not be able to develop net new pieces of artifacts, data sets, models, reports, because you're so limiting yourself. However, if you want to centralize your team and you have more users, a large user base, that may make sense. You may want to centralize around a couple of people that are only going to do modeling or only report building. So this is why I think Steve and I are making these points, is there's a balance between enough things to control, but not so much that we can't get anything done.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and again, depends on your organization, depends exactly as Mike said on the people and the resources. And often you start a bit smaller and you can evolve. And this is why we say they're living, right? And as your team grows, as the knowledge grows, you might require some more complexity and more features within it.
Well, with that, I think we've kind of wrapped our full topic around all the different items here. I think we're going to go a little bit deeper in a future video around just different architectures, patterns that we're seeing, things that are pros and cons of these different patterns. Kurt Bueller has done a really good job explaining how many different ways you can share a report. There's 1,000 different ways you can share reports these days. It's really exciting. However, those comes with trade-offs. So we'll try and give you patterns that we find works well in the organization at every level that makes sense for what your team's going to do. With that, thank you, Steve. Appreciate your talk today. This was great, very informative, great slides. We can talk through a lot of these concepts. We look forward to seeing you online, and we hope to see more videos like this, and we'll hope you join us for future videos.
Excellent. Thank you for having me, and look forward to the next ones.
Sounds great. Talk to you next time.